Good morning and welcome to the Japan Society's regular webinar on current affairs and business. I am Bill Emmott, and as many of you know, I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society. Thank you all for your support of the Japan Society and all of its online events. This week, we are looking back to one of the biggest natural disasters to have hit an advanced country in modern times, which triggered off one of the biggest man-made disasters. We are remembering, of course, the nearly 20,000 deaths caused by that day and the devastation wrought on the communities along the Tohoku coastline, as well as to those immediately surrounding the stricken nuclear power station of Fukushima Dai-ichi. But we will also be looking at the present to see what has been learned from Japan's devastating experiences of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown that began on March the 11th, 2011, and to discuss what still needs to be learned. Since we, the whole world, are now living through another natural disaster, the global pandemic, which is testing our societal resilience and the capability of institutions of all kinds to react and to adapt, the lessons of 3/11 are relevant to all of us. The destructive power of the huge tsunami was shared around the world, as we all remember, thanks to the ubiquity of cameras and communications. But also the response was a global one, with rescue teams arriving swiftly from all over the planet, including the United Kingdom. David Warren, who I'm delighted to welcome back as one of our speakers today, was at the center of that British response in his then role as UK ambassador, traveling immediately up to Tohoku with rescue teams and later connecting the UK government chief scientific advisor, Sir John Beddington, into the Japanese discourse. Yoichi Funabashi, our speaker joining us from Tokyo, I have known for many years as one of Japan's leading journalists on foreign affairs, especially on the US-Japan alliance and developments on the Korean Peninsula. A former editor-in-chief of the Asahi Shimbun, Yoichi took a central role in the response to the nuclear disaster by forming the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation and acting as program director for that foundation's independent investigation commission into the Fukushima Dai-ichi nuclear disaster. He has since enlarged the scope of the foundation to become the Asia-Pacific Initiative, arguably the country's leading independent think tank, especially on foreign affairs. Funabashi-san has just published a book on the Fukushima nuclear disaster, in Japanese as Countdown Meltdown, and now in English with the title simply Meltdown. And I'm going to read from the opening paragraph from the introduction because it sums things up so well. Fukushima is not yet over. The nuclear emergency declaration at the Fukushima Dai-ichi nuclear power plant has still not been lifted, even at the present juncture. Of the residents who were evacuated in line with evacuation instructions issued 4 times within 24 hours of the accident, a peak of 164,865 people in May 2012, 43,022 are still unable to return to their homes, at least as of August 2020. There were no deaths due to direct exposure to radiation during the accident, but indirect deaths due to the evacuation and subsequent stress amounted to 3,739 as of December 2019, according to the Reconstruction Agency. Radiation in the plant near the nuclear reactor is still high, and the situation inside the nuclear reactors cannot be confirmed. Before the accident, 54 nuclear power plants were operating in Japan, but as of the end of October 2020, only 9 reactors and 5 out of the 27 plants that have applied to restart have been approved. Fukushima is still not behind us. As usual, I'm going to ask our speakers to give us opening remarks of 10 minutes each, followed by discussion and, crucially, your questions. Please, as usual, submit them using the Q&A function and feel free to vote for other people's questions so as to bring them to my attention. I'm going to start with Yoichi Funabashi from Tokyo. Yoichi, welcome to the Japan Society. Over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. First, I would like to express my gratitude to the Japan Society to invite me to this event. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel with Bill Emmott, my old friend, and with Sir David Warren, whom I have held highest esteem as the United Kingdom veteran diplomat and expert on Japan. The Fukushima nuclear crisis was that Japan's largest national crisis since the end of World War II. But it was this point that Japan realized that it was almost totally unprepared for contingency planning on all fronts. In the thick of the crisis, the DPJ government instructed Dr. Shunsuke Kondo, a nuclear scientist, to come up with that worst case scenario, which he submitted late on March 25. In that scenario, Dr. Kondo envisioned that all that spent fuel pools would collapse, and fuel rods would intersect with concrete cement, which would release that massive radiation into the air. At that point, that TEPCO workers would not be able to operate the plant, and then they would have to evacuate from the scene. If that were the reality, that 30 million people in greater Tokyo area would then have to evacuate, but depending on the direction of the wind. Eastern part of Japan would have become a nuclear wasteland. So this is that crisis, the level of the crisis which could have been. What actually happened was indeed very lucky. The wind continued to flow offshore for 4 days from March 11 till March 15. But it was just sheer luck. That, but how could we allow this to happen? I'm talking about that peculiar social and political, psychological drive and dynamics of the root cause. The essence of that accident was a myth of nuclear safety promoted by the nuclear village. They believe that making changes to better the safety of nuclear plants would be an admission that existing precautions and regulations were insufficient. Since the public still had a strong anti-nuclear sentiments due to the traumatic experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they did not want to admit that these nuclear plants were not zero risk. Accordingly, nuclear regulatory authorities did not include a severe accident, nuclear accident such as SBO, station blackout, in contingency planning, simply because that would cause unnecessary anxiety and misunderstanding, quote unquote, among the public. SBO must not happen. Therefore, it will be treated as the unanticipated, the ultimate form of risk denial. Instead, they placed the highest priorities on small assurances at the expense of greater security of the people of Japan. This was the groupthink that developed among the nuclear village. they found themselves caught in their own trap, hence the myth of absolute safety. 10 years on, we see a new type of nuclear safety myth. Regulators demand that world's most strict safety standard from their operators. They want to demonstrate that they are much more independent and more transparent, as they feel compelled to differentiate themselves from that old regulatory regime, which were heavily criticized for its coziness with the electric company and the nuclear energy promoters, as well as conducting that opaque deliberations behind the scenes. As a result, the regulators now are more aloof and not engaging. They seem to want to convince the public that the new regulation is much more stringent and the newly authorized nuclear plants are completely safe, zero risk. Once again, the myth of absolute safety. Japan must be prepared for that worst case scenario, develop contingency plans, take a whole of society approach, establish fully a legal framework and governance to cope with the crisis. Back to that crisis. Meanwhile, at Japan's ally, the United States dispatched a maximum of 24,000 soldiers and sailors to the disaster area immediately after the earthquake. The US was not under treaty obligation to help Japan because that was not a military situation. It was a natural disaster. Nonetheless, President Obama immediately decided to side with Japan as a most critical juncture and order the military to help. That has become famous as a Tomodachi operation. In response to this, the Japanese public developed a strong appreciation for Barack Obama. Obama is by far the most popular US president since World War II. According to NHK opinion poll from February last year, Obama had 54% popularity rating, with the next run-up being JFK at 17%. Tomodachi operation and Obama's visit to Hiroshima certainly contributed to that perception. As the crisis unfolded, over 60% of the foreigners living in Kanto, which includes Tokyo and 7 prefectures, evacuated either abroad or to elsewhere in Japan. And embassies, one after another, discontinued their functions. Ambassador John Roos of the United States and Ambassador David Warren of the United Kingdom and several others among major countries, powers, decided to stay, even under tremendous pressures from their staff, particularly from their family members, to evacuate from Tokyo. However, Japan was also aware that during a nuclear crisis, if uncontrolled, the US military in Japan, particularly the Navy, would be forced to leave. If that were the case, it would do irreparable damage to the US-Japan alliance. On the other hand, the US became concerned about Japan's ability to cope with a crisis and whether the self-defense forces had a determination to do a heroic act, quote unquote, as Kurt Campbell, then the Assistant Secretary of State, strongly urged Ambassador Ichiro Fujisaki. Japan learned a heavy lesson from the crisis that is very vulnerable in terms of crisis management and crisis management governance. And that vulnerability would be detrimental to maintaining the US-Japan alliance. This awareness have also been heightened and sensitized by Japan being more exposed to China's aggressiveness and its testing of Japan's resolve on the Senkaku Islands. after DPJ government fell, the Abe administration decided to defend its own territories first and foremost by themselves, and enacted a law to allow Japan to exercise a collective self-defense so as to strengthen the US-Japan alliance. The lessons learned during the Fukushima crisis created a backdrop for searching for a more resilient and independent Japan, eventually evolving Japan's national security state. Albeit that this kind of evolution does not occur in a straight line, but rather in a zigzag, which can be seen in the most recent Japanese government response to COVID-19 crisis. Though the Fukushima crisis may feel like it ended years ago, in truth, the crisis is not over yet. We have come far from where we were in the initial moments of the crisis, but we still have a long way to go before the crisis is truly over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Funabashi-san. I think it's particularly salutary not only to underline that point that there is a long way to go, but also I think that the critical nature of that crisis for the US-Japan alliance and for Japan's sense of vulnerability is something that is often overlooked or at least not appreciated. And I'm very grateful to you for emphasizing that. David Warren, you were there, you stayed there as well, which I think was very good. What are your reflections 10 years on?
Well, thank you, Bill, for organizing this morning's webinar, for inviting me and Dr. Funabashi to take part. The first thing I want to say is that a lot of people on this call who are listening to us, and we have nearly 200 people, will remember vividly the events that took place 10 years ago next week. Some of us, as you say, were in Japan at the time. Some of us were watching with horror from other countries as they unfolded. And I suppose our first point has to be that this is an act of memory, because we remember the three separate disasters which took place in quick succession, as you've outlined: the earthquake, the strongest ever recorded in Japan, magnitude 9, the fourth most powerful anywhere in the world since records began; the tsunami, which followed an hour later, which wrought such terrible damage and destruction across the whole of the northeastern seaboard of Japan and accounted for over 20,000 deaths, and over 2,000 people are still missing. And then the accident at Fukushima Dai-ichi, as the tsunami swamped the nuclear power station's cooling systems, including the backup diesel generators, and sent the power station into meltdown. With such a terrible death toll and so much unimaginable destruction of so many coastal communities, it seems wrong to talk also about the economic cost of this crisis, but the World Bank estimated the full cost of these disasters as around $235 billion. And there was a major impact on the Japanese economy at the time, to the surprise of a lot of commentators who had not realized just how crucial the Tohoku region was to so many industrial supply chains. The fact that the Japanese archipelago was so interconnected, it came as a little bit of a surprise to some people. As you say, I was there at the time as ambassador, and I was working with many colleagues in Tokyo and from around the world, as well as the Foreign Office in London, to ensure that the British Embassy, which, as Dr. Funabashi said, remained functioning in Tokyo throughout the crisis, in common with a number of other embassies, supported the Japanese government and the people of Japan, as well as helping the hundreds of British nationals who were caught up in the disaster. I wasn't planning to speak in great detail about the work we did, because in a sense, this is about Japan. We're talking about Japan's response to the crisis rather than about us, but I'm very happy to answer some questions on that, and to talk particularly about the John Beddington Chief Scientific Advisor angle, which I've already seen a couple of questions from David Cope on the Q&A. And as we get into Q&A, I'm happy to go into some of that in more detail if it's interesting for people. I firstly want to echo Dr. Funabashi's words that we are dealing still with the legacy of 3/11. We've mentioned the thousands of people who are still missing, the fact that most of the evacuation orders around Fukushima have been lifted, but the vast majority of people who live there have moved away permanently. And as you said, Bill, there are still over 40,000 evacuees. And the most recent Japanese government figures I could find suggest that there are still 1,000 people living in temporary accommodation. There has been, I think, impressive rebuilding and reconstruction in the areas affected. I haven't been myself to the Tohoku for some years now, but the government, I know, are putting a lot of investment into those regions. But the psychological cost in terms of mental illness, loneliness, grieving, separation from communities, this is much harder to measure and in all probability really substantial. And we ought also to remember the tremendous contribution so many non-governmental organizations, including the Japan Society, and in Japan, the British Chamber of Commerce, and a lot of other voluntary organizations made in the immediate aftermath of the terrible disaster to the reconstruction of specific communities. There are so many examples of that. Then there's the impact of Fukushima on perceptions of nuclear energy. Before 2011, nuclear accounted for something like 30% of Japanese electricity generation, and all the forecasts envisaged that nuclear would play an increasing part in the energy mix. And Fukushima changed all that irrevocably. You mentioned the fact that most power stations, nuclear power stations, are shut. There are 9 still open, but nuclear accounts for a tiny proportion of Japan's energy at the moment, around 6%. The 2030 target, which was announced last year, is that it should rise to about a fifth of Japan's energy needs, but it's hard to see how that's going to happen while resources are so depleted unless nuclear capacity is increased. And it's also hard, I think, to see quite how Prime Minister Suga's commitment to go zero carbon by 2050 is going to be achievable without nuclear representing a larger part of the energy mix. The trauma of Fukushima is still palpable in all these areas, in spite of TEPCO's continuing efforts to remove the contaminated water and the spent uranium fuel from the site. And these efforts are going to be carrying on for years and years. Dr. Funabashi is absolutely right. We are nowhere near a resolution of all these difficult questions. And of course, the profound doubt about the viability of nuclear energy is not limited to Japan as a result of the Fukushima disaster, even if the immediate impact of Fukushima was less severe than of Chernobyl over 30 years ago. I was very interested in reading Dr. Funabashi's book, Meltdown, at what he said about what the disaster told us about crisis management in Japan. His book is a fascinating blow-by-blow account of what happened during those terrible days in the immediate aftermath of the Fukushima accident. And he put his finger, I think, on a crucial element in this, which is the ability to evaluate and to manage risk. One of the criticisms of the Japanese government and TEPCO at the time was that the risk of a Fukushima-type accident was so massive, as risk analysts would say, high impact, even if likelihood wasn't necessarily seen as high, that no coherent plan was made as to how to deal with it. And there's a really important point there, I think, about how we manage risk, rather than how we try and avoid all risk. I often felt, living in Japan, both as ambassador and as a diplomat over many years, and I'm always hesitant about making too many cultural generalizations, but I always felt that the emphasis in Japan tended to be on risk avoidance rather than risk management. And the danger of that is that it can lead to people not facing the absolute worst case scenario, but only the most reasonable worst case scenario. And that can be a problem if you have a once in 100 years event and you find yourselves having to manage the consequences. But I do want to say one word, even if this is a bit unfashionable, in defense of Prime Minister Kan, who's strongly criticized for the government's immediate response to the disaster. Yes, he can be criticized for losing his temper with everybody. He can be criticized for trying to micromanage things. But as Funabashi-san's book, I think, makes clear in its final chapter, Kan was the man who forced the response to the crisis to move up a gear to a proper emergency response, rather than simply attempting to follow the rule book. And he did this because he saw an existential issue for the Japanese government. If they could not get on top of the crisis, Japan would be perceived in the eyes of the world as a failed state. And he understood, as not all Japanese prime ministers have understood before him, how accountable a political leader has to be in those circumstances. And I think that takes us into the third area that I really just wanted to speak about briefly, which is the relationship between scientific advice and politics. In Dr. Funabashi's book, he describes the tension in Washington during the crisis. There was strong tension between the military, who were so alarmed by the difficulty of getting data out of the Japanese government that they wanted aggressive evacuation plans for all US forces and citizens in Japan, and State Department diplomats led by Kirk Campbell and Ambassador John Roos at the embassy in Tokyo, who took a more proportionate view. Now, in London, we did not go through precisely those same tensions because the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, which we've all now in Britain got to know really well over the past year with the pandemic, SAGE as it's called, SAGE were able to produce, under the chairmanship of John Beddington, who was the government's chief scientific advisor, an assessment of the risks of the worst case outcome in Fukushima that showed that these would be manageable outside the Fukushima area. When that SAGE advice came out on, I think, the Monday after the crisis, which was the Monday after the tsunami, which was the point at which the situation at Fukushima was beginning to deteriorate with the explosions in the respective units. My deputy head of mission, David Fitton, suggested that it would be helpful if John Beddington could do a teleconference with British residents in Tokyo to explain this. And this helped to calm everybody's nerves. The embassy then tweeted Sir John's advice, and so it reached a much wider audience, including in the Japanese government, who were able to use it in their own communications. President Obama's chief scientist, John Holdren, played a similar role, I think, in Washington in helping to settle the interagency dispute about evacuation plans by giving a clear and balanced scientific assessment of the probable worst case outcome, which was that. And I'm going to just minimize my screen here for a second so that I can find a way of reading you John Beddington's advice, because this is what he said to the British community on the 18th of March. Even in that worst case scenario, which was a simultaneous release from the ponds containing the equivalent of 6 reactor cores and the 3 at-risk reactors at Fukushima, and a change in the weather, because up to that point it was blowing out into the Pacific, and this envisaged that it might change direction and blow towards Tokyo. Even in that worst case situation, and I would emphasize that this is an extremely unlikely case, the level of radiation around Tokyo would be extremely modest. Although there would be radiation increases, even in this extreme case, the effect on human health could be substantially mitigated by just taking very simple precautions, essentially staying indoors while the plume of radiation passed over, not having your ventilation on, and keeping your windows closed. That was the SAGE advice to the government, and that was John Beddington's explanation of its advice to the British community. He came out to Tokyo several times thereafter to speak to the Japanese government and other groups. And I remember some Japanese officials saying to me, we really need someone like this in the Japanese government to give clear leadership in crises of this kind. And I said to them, yes, but remember that there has to be political leadership. John Beddington is not a politician. He is a scientist. He explains what the science is telling us, which is always evolving, and it evolved a lot during this crisis. It changed several times. It is the politicians that have to be in a position to take the decisions on how to respond. I've thought about these conversations many times over the past year, as the British government have struggled with its response to the pandemic. And we've sometimes heard politicians say, when they're accused of locking down too slowly, or sometimes by other people, they're accused of locking down too rigorously, well, we have been following the science. My experience during this terrible crisis 10 years ago in Japan is that it's never as simple as saying you're following the science. You can't, as a politician, avoid the need to make a political judgment, and you have to be prepared to explain and defend that political judgment when challenged. There is so much that one can say about this event, and I've tried to draw a few themes out of what happened, while at the same time keeping the awful suffering of the victims and the continuing suffering of those who were affected by the crisis, as Dr. Funabashi has indicated, in our minds. But I do hope, Bill, that as we get into the question and answer session, we can start to get into the detail of some of these really complicated issues. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, David. That was very, very interesting and very powerful. I'm going to come to the questions in next, but I'm first of all going to ask Funabashi-san to respond to David's thought about leadership in the crisis, about Prime Minister Kan. I know you've got obviously big sections in your book about it and everyone will buy it, but nevertheless, do you also, I think you do actually also agree, but nevertheless say that in the crisis, in escalating this to the emergency level, did Prime Minister Kan show an important element of leadership that without it, things could have been quite different?
Yeah, I think so. I think Kan certainly, failed in, being up to the leadership in ordinary times. But in an extraordinary crisis, such as Fukushima crisis, I think, he actually really changed the mode from that, ordinary mode to crisis mode, contingency mode. For instance, he actually stormed into that TEPCO's headquarters with his, entourage, 5:30 in the morning on March 15, at the most fateful day, and demanded that the TEPCO and government jointly set up that headquarters. It was an extra legal measure. Nonetheless, I think that really flattened the decision-making process, which he had been so much frustrated since that March 11, with that lack of information coming from TEPCO, and it's always had been processed, and it was not in timely fashion, and he actually realized, and that TEPCO had a teleconference mechanism with that Fukushima Dai-ichi on-site, contingency room, which the government official had not been aware of that. So it was so shocking to him. I think that's all his initiative. And he met a lot of oppositions and reservation from his even policy advisors, but he did it, overruled it, and I give a lot of credit to him.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's very convincing. I'm going to go. There's a lot of questions coming in, as you might expect, a lot of praise for very insightful and moving presentations. So thank you to you both. The first, the question that seems to have got a lot of votes, which I feel I should ask, even though with 2 out of 3 people on the screen being from the media, perhaps it's a sensitive one. I'll ask David to. Christopher Hood asks, in what ways did the UK Embassy in Japan monitor the UK media's reporting of Fukushima and do anything about trying to ensure that accurate information was included rather than a more sensationalist approach? What did you think about the communication issue back internationally, really?
Well, it's a fascinating question. Of course, we were monitoring information all the time. Without getting into too much of the detail here, I hope, the embassy organized itself into a crisis center. There were various teams operating in different areas. One of them was a team gathering information and news, both from Japanese sources about what was happening on the ground in the area and also from international sources. And there was, run more from London than from Tokyo, a news and information management operation through the Foreign Office press office with UK media. And I did, I think, about 25 interviews with BBC, ITN, Sky, and other news outlets in the course of the first week. Regular updates each day, trying to get a balanced and proportionate and accurate picture across of the actions of the British government by way of emergency response to support British nationals, and as far as we could, an accurate understanding of what was going on the ground in Fukushima, which was very difficult because, for all the reasons Dr. Funabashi gives, it was hard for the Japanese government, let alone for us, to get accurate data. It was striking that the international news coverage of the event was not just powerful and harrowing. Obviously it would be that because the images were so harrowing, but in some outlets, excitable and to a degree that really suggested a much more existential meltdown than was in fact the case. I was struck by the number of people who formed an assumption that, in a sense, the country had been covered by radiation and that it was unsafe to travel anywhere in Japan. This was clearly not the case. It was not the case for us living in Tokyo, let alone in parts of the country much further away from the epicenter of the accident. There's a disturbing question in my mind here about just how difficult it is in the immediate aftermath of a crisis of this kind, not just to get accurate and credible information, but to get a proportionate understanding of the risks involved. And this was a very specific question for us because there were 3 things we had to do as a crisis response center. Firstly, support the Japanese government with equipment if necessary. Not a great deal was needed, but we did provide some, and emergency help, as we've said, search and rescue team. And we got in a couple of days after the tsunami to operate in the Tohoku region. Secondly, to find British nationals who were in the area and evacuate them if they wished to be evacuated. Not all did. Thirdly, and the most difficult because of Fukushima, to offer accurate travel advice to people both inside and outside Japan who were thinking of traveling to the country. Obviously, no question of traveling to the Tohoku, but the country itself had not totally closed its borders. And that travel advisory, as we call it, to British nationals is in a sense your risk assessment. And it's a risk assessment which you have to keep under constant review every hour by hour, be prepared to amend as the situation on the ground seems to change, and at the same time be prepared to defend against people criticizing you either for being too complacent or for being too restrictive. In the face of some international media coverage, I exempt here the major outlets like BBC, CNN, and so forth. It was very difficult to get a real sense of accuracy into this, but we did our best.
Thank you. I'm going to move to a question from a Japanese participant, Takeshi Shimizu, who's said he's really questioning the phrase "zero risk" that you Yoichi have used. And he says he feels the obsession to zero risk has been very unique to the response of Japanese people, particularly Japanese media. For example, Japanese standard of radiation is, he says, 10 times stricter than the European standard. For COVID-19, the death per population in Japan is 100 times less than the EU. Still, the Japanese authority has been criticized by media and public for its failure, in quotes, even in these unforeseeable disasters, while the British response was much calmer. Do you not think it is too harsh to criticize Japanese authority for its response and policy on this basis of zero risk obsession? How do you think about that issue of caution and approach to risk that also David Warren, of course, mentioned? Yoichi.
Yeah, I think that this zero risk obsession, risk denial obsession, I think is deeply ingrained in Japan and Japanese society, particularly in perhaps I think in post-war era. One of the backdrop is, as I mentioned, the traumatic experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But this phenomenon does not just take place in the radiation field area, but it's almost elsewhere that we see this tendency of risk, ultimate risk averseness. And I think that is a sort of consensus among the executives, legislature, and even the court, and certainly among the media. I would call this is small assurances populism. Nobody wants to really challenge that this small assurances regime. Simply because if you challenge, you'd be denounced, you'd be criticized for not being sufficiently caring for the people's concern and anxiety. I think this is a problem. As Japanese society gets older and older, Japan is now the demographics, the oldest populace in the world. I think this risk averseness has become to be more, I think, that pervasive and normal. And this really, I think, would put that new regulator, new regulatory body also in a very much difficult position. They have to demonstrate that they have to keep imposing the most stringent standards on the operator and also visibly to the public, because that's the surest way to satisfy the people and assure the people. So they also now, it seems to me, found themselves caught in their own trap again.
Thank you. And I would just observe that perhaps that is also there behind the policy on vaccines and vaccination currently in the response to the pandemic. David Cope, I should pop this question to you, David Warren. Just it's a quick yes or no, really. As you've seen, he says, can you confirm there was some argument in the UK cabinet to override the advice of John Beddington and to order an evacuation of UK citizens from Japan? As you've alluded to that in moderating, in your comment about moderating and mediating some of the debate, but what was there a serious consideration of evacuation of British citizens?
There was. We were instructed to draw up evacuation plans. We had no evacuation plans for the evacuation of the whole British community. We had. This is why I'm hesitant to, criticize other governments for adopting trying to adopt a zero risk approach, because we can also be criticized for that. Perhaps we had not drawn up evacuation plans that envisaged we would have to move 17,000 people out of Japan. And there was a shift in the scientific advice in the course of the week. When SAGE began to advise on the Monday and Tuesday, they were clear that the worst case scenario was entirely manageable, and it was in any event unlikely. The situation worsened on the Tuesday and I think the Wednesday as the units blew up. The advice remained still that the situation was manageable, but that it might be necessary to take precautionary measures. That was one of the reasons which lay behind the decision to issue iodine to British nationals, which was taken, I think, on the Thursday, and the first iodine supplies arrived on the Friday. And we handed out a small amount of iodine. There wasn't an enormous demand for it to some British nationals. I go into that detail because I want to indicate that the scientific advice was constantly evolving as the situation was evolving. But there was never any question in any discussion at Cobra that British nationals should evacuate from Japan. The travel advice was nuanced on the Thursday to advise. I'm just going to read from the relevant document because I want to get this absolutely right. Our travel advice was changed overnight on the Wednesday and Thursday, following discussion at Cobra, from recommending against non-essential travel to suggesting that British nationals should consider leaving Tokyo without actively recommending them to do so. We thought that that was the right nuance of advice to reflect the fact that the scientific assessment was now itself a little more equivocal, but there was no question of overriding the scientific advice. And in a sense, with respect to my old friend David Cope, it would be wrong to think in terms of overriding the advice. The advice is what it is, or the assessment is what it is. The question for the cabinet or for Cobra was, what operationally do you do in the light of that advice? And the answer was to nuance the travel advice so as to make clear that the risks were marginally less favorable than they had been earlier in the week. And that's what we did.
Thank you. Now there is a question, almost a technical question, really, about reporting of casualties after the disaster, particularly the tsunami. Ian Ruxton asks, after 10 years, surely the missing, quotes, people are now dead, but are they not yet counted as such? Will they ever be? I wonder if you could briefly explain this, as it were, data reporting issue, Yoichi, about how the numbers are defined in the Japanese context, because I've often found that mysterious.
I'm not too much familiar with that number discrepancy, and I don't think that has emerged as a big political issue over the past 10 years. I may be wrong, and I may not be aware of that, but as far as I know, I don't think that has ever been a big issue.
No, well, I think it.
Yeah, but to elaborate further, why is that is such a big problem?
It's not perhaps a problem. I think Christopher Hood may answer in the chat as to what he sees the answer as, but I think it's probably simply an international miss or lack of understanding about, as it were, how casualties are reported in Japan. So it wouldn't be an internal problem in Japan, because obviously the Japanese public, Japanese media would understand exactly this nature, but it seems strange 10 years after to see data that is presented as a certain number, 19,000 dead, and some still quite large number, 2,000 or 3,000, I think it is, reported missing. when one sort of assumes that 10 years after you know, it must be known whether they're dead and shouldn't they be defined as dead. But that's about, I think, social systems and social reporting systems rather than real discrepancies. So it's simply about different. So I think Christopher Hood will answer in the chat and we'll get that sorted. There are a lot of questions about the parallels to COVID-19 and planning, crisis management planning. Richard Siver, Alison Beale, Yuichiro Nakajima asking about crisis management, worst case scenario planning. What lessons can the UK and Japan learn about current thinking on potential future worst case scenarios and crisis prevention? Is it a pipe dream that governments prepare seriously for all worst case scenarios, or are perhaps the zero risk point that we were discussing just now is something of a sort of a framing factor for the Japanese government? How much better would Japan be now, Japanese government institutions now be in planning for worst case scenarios? Yoichi first and then David. And what are the lessons for the UK, perhaps David can suggest?
Yeah, I think that the Japanese government has been agonizingly slow of appreciating that the critical importance of envisioning that worst case scenario, particularly with regard to several most critical national security issues as well as safety issues. For instance, in the first wave of COVID-19, the first 6 months of last year, Japanese government has not done that well, but it has managed to do relatively well in terms of deaths per million, for instance. And then during the summer, I think that they really should have drafted the worst case scenario. They didn't do anything. Then, they actually introduced very much economic stimulus packages, go to travel included. And so, they are now they have been going through a much more difficult situation right now. In the ordinary time, it would be extremely difficult for the bureaucrats to come up with that contingency planning. So that was very exceptional, a time when DPJ government actually was forced to come up with a contingency planning. That was the only time, as I recall, for any Japanese government in the post-war era to really try to be prepared for the worst case scenario. So now the Japanese government officials have started to talk about that strengthen the surge capacity. And they also have acted revising the law to actually punish that the people who are not who do not act upon that government instructions and the orders. So this is the first time for Japanese government to really start to change that contingency element into the legal framework in Japan. So unrelated to military. So we are seeing some beginning of change, but it's still very slow.
David, how do you reflect on this?
Well, I listened with great interest to what Dr. Funabashi said, and he is better placed to assess, I think, how the Japanese government is responding now than I am. But I would just make the point that I lived through not just the 3/11 disaster, but the 1995 Kobe earthquake when I was on a previous posting to Tokyo. And I don't think there was any comparison between the two Japanese government responses. In 1995, the response was much slower. There was much less immediate understanding. This was partly because it took some time for the gravity of the Kobe earthquake really to be understood in Tokyo. But even when by lunchtime that day in January, it was clear that this was a major disaster with major loss of life, the Japanese government took, under Prime Minister Murayama, I think, took much, much longer to realize that it had to get a grip on this than was the case in the immediate aftermath of the 3/11 earthquake, which was felt strongly in Tokyo, which was an even stronger earthquake, and where the damage was even more obvious, even more quickly. But I formed the rough impression that Japanese government emergency responses had immeasurably improved over the 16 years between the two disasters. As I'm looking at this as very much as a layman, but I can't believe that the current world pandemic is not going to have a profound impact on how governments try to at least to scan the horizon to understand the problems which are likely suddenly to come out of a blue sky, and to take reasonable steps to prepare some sort of response to them. Fascinating article in this morning's Financial Times by David Pilling, who many of us know, who was in Japan for many years, about the inevitability of another zoonotic pandemic and the obvious steps which all governments need to be taking now in terms of early warning systems and investment in order to guard against this, bearing in mind this is the third coronavirus to jump from bats to humans in the last 20 years. So, you know, there is much more forward thinking, and I'm sure the Japanese government will be as much part of that as our government will.
Thank you, and I apologize for having disappeared thanks to my internet for a few moments during that, but I'm glad to be back. We've only got a few moments left, and I'm going to just take my privilege to ask a little more about the security and US-Japan implications of what happened 10 years ago. Richard Thornley has made a point that the role of the self-defense forces in the rescue was actually much noted upon and praised at the time as being far superior to some previous disasters like the Kobe earthquake and others, the JAL crash in 1985 and so forth. So that there was already some improvement in immediate response. But I wonder if both of you could finish by looking now at Japan's defense and security position and this desire to be more autonomous. How far has Japan got? And of course, we've had the shock of Trump for the last 4 years, different in Japan from in other countries, but this sense of Japan's desire to be autonomous, where does it take us? Yoichi.
Yeah, you just mentioned briefly on the role of self-defense forces. I think that the 3/11 perpetually changed that perception and acceptance of the self-defense forces among the public. The Japanese public has long harbored some suspicion, even animosity towards the military in post-war era, much thanks to their bitter memories of military rule in pre-war days. But the self-defense forces dedication to rescue on the ground, I think that was really, a decisive moment. Even the emperor lauded that dedication, self-defense forces in the emperor's extraordinary remark on March 16th. So I think that's is a new, paradigm shift in Japanese political context. I think the SDF now is by far the most trusted public institution in Japan, even higher than the court. So, but the problem is that, SDF was actually regarded as the last bastion in 3/11. But now they are in high demand whenever the Japan is hit by disaster and pandemic. And so SDF is now becoming a kind of, bastion for anybody at any time, jack of all trades. I think that's a new dilemma.
David, final word from you on this issue about the SDF and security issues.
Thank you, Bill. I'll answer that, and if I can just say one other thing quickly before we close. On that, again, I defer to Dr. Funabashi, but I agree with him entirely that one of the things which came out of the crisis was a much greater understanding of the role of the SDF in emergency response and reconstruction, and great respect for the SDF. And that is a change of mood in post-war Japan, definitely. The question of how far Japan can develop what the Europeans call strategic autonomy in this area, I think that depends on many factors which we don't have time to go into today, not least the commitment of the US administration to the alliance, and the commitment of the Biden administration, if pressed, to provide the same support and moral and practical support as the Obama administration did in 2011 to help Japan with its self-defense requirements. There is often, we've all been on, I guess, lots of webinars where people talk about Japan's strategic options, and the question is always asked, is Japan likely to want to adopt a much more self-reliant strategic military option, even to the extent of going nuclear at some point? I have to say, if it seems so difficult for the Japanese government and Japanese people to embrace peaceful use of nuclear energy in the wake of Fukushima, I can't believe that it's going to be at all straightforward even to have a debate on the subject of acquiring a nuclear weapons capacity. So I continue to put myself in the camp of those who think that sort of strategic outcome is deeply unlikely. Can I just say one quick thing, which I perhaps ought to have not mentioned before, but just to pick up. There's a comment on the Q&A from my old friend and colleague, Paul Hunter, who was the economic counselor in the embassy at the time, pointing out, and I would like just to re-emphasize this, that most families and all staff at the British Embassy during this period wanted to stay. I just wanted to, with great respect to Dr. Funabashi, I just wanted to correct the statement that there was strong pressure from families to leave. I know the American Embassy and some other embassies, I think this was the case, and I understand why. And we, in the British Embassy, offered families the opportunity to evacuate if they wished to. And of course, some families with spouses and partners who were working for big international companies did evacuate, as a lot of people working for multinational firms did. But the commitment of the British Embassy staff, both British and locally engaged, the vast majority of whom were Japanese, was absolute to staying in Tokyo, and their commitment and dedication was profoundly impressive and humbling. So if I just want to finish on one personal memory of these events, it's
thank you
to
for
pay tribute to them. Thank you, Paul, for making that point.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Yoichi, for giving us a wonderful experience and briefing about what happened 10 years ago and how things are today. It's been a very, very interesting discussion and very, very enlightening. The questions, I'm sorry I couldn't get to more of the questions and comments, and I thank everyone who attended the seminar for providing such good questions. And I'm sure that you could write directly to either of our speakers if you want any further specific answers. On climate change and energy policy, it's clear from some of the questions that we need another webinar on that topic, because I think the issue of post-nuclear Japan and the path to net zero in carbon emissions is a very important one that we need to address. But most of all, I want to thank Yoichi Funabashi and David Warren for sparing the time and expertise for being with us today. And thank you all for attending, and have a very good day. And I also want to, I don't think you can say a good set of celebrations of such a terrible event, but I hope there will be and commemorations and recollections in both Japan and the rest of the world on this event of 10 years ago will be meaningful and will be serious reflections, just as we have experienced and enjoyed for the last hour. So thank you, Funabashi-san, and thank you, David Warren.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bill. Yoichi. Bye-bye for now.